The galaxy knows Count Dooku as a Sith Lord, a separatist war leader, and a traitor to the Jedi. His name is etched into the annals of history as the architect of galactic war, the fallen Jedi who cast aside his teachings in pursuit of something greater. Yet his story does not begin in the shadows of the Sith. It begins in nobility, in the towering halls of Serenno, where power is not earned, it is inherited. Serenno is not like the bureaucratic core worlds that bow before the Republic's decrees. It is a place of old power, where aristocrats govern through lineage rather than elections. Wealth and influence are not given. They are cultivated over generations, safeguarded through political maneuvering, diplomacy, and, when necessary, quiet ruthlessness. Among these ruling houses, the Dooku bloodline is one of the most prestigious, a name that commands respect and instills fear in equal measure. Their legacy stretches back centuries, shaping the course of the Mid-Rim with careful precision. To such a house, the arrival of an heir should have been a moment of triumph. But when Count Gora's son was born, he did not see a future leader. He saw a threat. The child was not merely strong, he was something else, something unnatural. The Force had marked him from birth, binding him to a power beyond the control of noble rule. Among the Jedi, this would be seen as a blessing. Among Serenno's aristocracy, it was a complication, one that could not be ignored. For Count Gora, the decision was clear. A Force-sensitive heir meant an unpredictable future. The child's destiny would no longer be his own. It would belong to the Jedi Order, an institution that demanded absolute loyalty, severing all ties to home, to name, to legacy. This was not something the House of Dooku could tolerate. A noble son should be groomed for leadership, for power. But a Jedi belonged to the Republic, to an order that answered not to bloodlines, but to doctrine. That was a future Gora would not allow. And so, the child was given away. Not with the reverence that some families showed when offering their children to the Jedi, but with cold efficiency. There was no ceremony, no farewell. His name was erased from the records, his existence buried beneath layers of political necessity. Serenno would move forward as if he had never been born. His father's will was law, and in the eyes of his family, he no longer existed. There is irony in Gora's decision, one that history would make clear. By casting away his son, he did not protect the House of Dooku. He ensured its reckoning. The child he had discarded would return to Serenno, not as a lost son, but as a conqueror. Within the Jedi Temple, the boy would never know of his true heritage, not at first. He was given a new identity, shaped by the teachings of the Order, raised among initiates who would become his only family. The Jedi discouraged attachment, demanded the relinquishment of all past ties. But something within him resisted. Even without knowing the truth, he could feel it. He was different. The other younglings found camaraderie in their shared training, forming bonds that would last lifetimes. Dooku did not. Where others embraced their place within the Order, he stood apart, colder, more disciplined. His instructors saw his potential early, recognizing the prodigious talent that set him apart. His control over the Force was remarkable, his lightsaber technique beyond his years. But with that brilliance came something else: pride. That pride deepened when whispers of his origins began to reach him. A noble house, a father who had rejected him. The Jedi sought to bury such knowledge, fearing it would create longing, resentment, dangerous emotions for one who was meant to walk the path of detachment. But that knowledge did not create longing. It created certainty. Dooku did not see his heritage as something to be forgotten. He saw it as something stolen. As the years passed, that belief hardened. He looked at the Republic the Jedi were sworn to protect, and he saw weakness, corruption, decay. He watched as senators enriched themselves while entire star systems were left to rot in neglect. He heard the Jedi Council speak of patience, while the galaxy crumbled around them. If the Jedi were meant to be the guardians of peace, why did they stand idle? Why did they refuse to act? These thoughts did not come to him in a single moment of revelation. They took root gradually, growing deeper with time, sharpened by every mission that exposed the Republic's failures. He followed orders, respected the Council, but inside, his faith in the Order's wisdom began to wane. He could see what others could not, or perhaps what others refused to acknowledge. The Jedi had tied themselves to the Republic, to a system that no longer worked, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. He remained patient. He continued to learn, to refine his skills, to rise through the ranks. He had not yet found his path, not yet reached the moment where he would make his choice. But deep within, a truth had already settled. One day, the Order would fall. One day, he would be the one to cast the first stone. The halls of the Jedi Temple were a world apart from the palatial estates of Serenno, where noble courts were adorned with gilded tapestries and towering spires. The temple was stark in its simplicity. It was a place of discipline, of rigid order, where luxury was replaced by austerity and where names held no meaning. Here, the weight of heritage was cast aside, and identity was shaped not by birthright, but by devotion to the Force. For Dooku, this transition should have been absolute. From infancy, he had been conditioned to accept the Jedi way, trained to suppress the past in favor of duty. Yet something within him resisted. Unlike the other younglings, who accepted the Order as their only home, he was always aware that he had come from somewhere else. That knowledge set him apart, creating a quiet barrier between himself and his peers, one that would only grow with time. From the beginning, he was extraordinary. His connection to the Force was stronger than most of his instructors had seen in generations. His skill with a lightsaber was evident even as a child, his movements precise, his form elegant. Where others struggled, he excelled, surpassing initiates years older than himself. But with that brilliance came something more, a quiet, unspoken superiority. Dooku was disciplined, controlled, but he was never humble. He did not seek approval, nor did he desire camaraderie. While other younglings forged friendships that would last lifetimes, he remained distant, detached, existing on the edges of their world rather than within it. He did not see himself as their equal. To him, the Jedi Order was filled with those who clung to tradition without question, who obeyed without thought. He did not resent them, but he did not respect them either. The Jedi Council took notice of him early, and so did Master Yoda. The Grand Master of the Order had trained many generations of Jedi, and he had seen brilliance before. Yet Dooku was different. There was a sharpness to his mind, a hunger for understanding that went beyond the usual curiosity of a young Jedi. His questions were pointed, often challenging. He sought knowledge not simply to learn, but to master. Yoda saw the promise in him, but he also saw the danger. There was rigidity in Dooku's thinking, a mind too sure of itself, too willing to question without considering the wisdom of restraint. He sensed pride, something that had undone many Jedi before. And yet, Dooku was not defiant. He followed instruction, excelled in his training, and carried himself with the composure of a future master. But even the most disciplined mind cannot be shielded from doubt forever. That doubt first took root when he began to question the Jedi's role in the Republic. The Order taught that the Jedi were guardians of peace, that they served the Republic as its protectors, its enforcers of justice. Yet as Dooku grew older, he saw the contradiction. The Republic was flawed, governed by politicians who spoke of democracy but acted in self-interest. Was it truly justice if the Jedi upheld a system that allowed corruption to thrive? Was it truly peace if entire worlds suffered while the Senate debated endlessly over policy? He raised these concerns to his instructors, but the answers were always the same: patience, faith in the system, trust in the wisdom of the Council. Dooku heard these words, but he did not accept them. The Republic was not worthy of blind loyalty, and yet the Jedi bound themselves to it as though they had no choice. It was a contradiction he could not ignore. And then there was Genza, his sister, the last living link to his lost past. It was forbidden for Jedi to maintain connections to their former lives. Attachment led to suffering, and suffering led to the dark side. But Dooku had never known his family. He had never known what it was to belong to something beyond the Order. When Genza found him, sending quiet messages through encrypted channels, he could not turn away. Their correspondence was cautious, hidden from the watchful eyes of the Council. Through her, he learned of Serenno, of the world that had abandoned him, of the father who had cast him aside, of the aristocracy that still held power over the Mid-Rim. Genza did not understand his world, but she understood him. She saw in him not a Jedi, but the heir he had been meant to be. Through her, he glimpsed an existence that had been stolen from him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if he had been meant for something more. This connection did not weaken him. It did not turn him away from the Jedi path. But it confirmed something he had always known but never spoken aloud. He was different. He was not like the others, not bound by the same unquestioning loyalty. He had been cast aside once, shaped into something new, but the blood of Serenno still ran through him. Dooku continued his training, continued to rise. He followed orders, followed tradition, honed his abilities until there were few who could challenge him. But he did not forget. He carried the weight of knowledge that the Council sought to keep from him. He saw the cracks in the Republic, the stagnation within the Jedi Order. He was still their student, still their servant. But the day would come when he would decide whether to remain so. Among the Jedi, skill with a lightsaber was a matter of survival. It was the weapon of a guardian, the last defense against chaos. To many, it was merely an extension of their duty, a tool to be wielded only when diplomacy failed. But to Dooku, it was something far more, a discipline, a philosophy, a reflection of one's mastery over both the body and the mind. From the earliest days of his training, his talent was undeniable. While other initiates struggled to grasp the fundamentals of combat, Dooku moved with precision, as if the blade had always been a part of him. His form was elegant, his strikes measured. He learned quickly, surpassing many of his instructors before he had even reached knighthood. In time, his skill drew the attention of Master Yoda, who took a personal role in refining his abilities. Under Yoda's tutelage, Dooku's technique became something extraordinary. While the Jedi favored Form 1, the most basic and universal of lightsaber styles, Dooku sought a different path. He studied the ways of the ancient duelists, drawn to the elegance and precision of Makashi, Form 2, a style designed not for deflecting blaster fire, but for engaging other lightsaber-wielding opponents. It was a relic of a bygone era, a form few still practiced, seen as impractical in an age where Jedi rarely faced enemies armed with blades. But Dooku saw its value. He refined its movements, adapted its principles, perfecting every motion until it was second nature. Makashi was not a form of brute strength or raw aggression. It was a style of efficiency, of control. Every step, every parry, every counterattack was designed to outmaneuver and disarm an opponent with minimal effort. Where others relied on strength, Dooku relied on precision. His mastery grew until few could challenge him. Even seasoned Jedi masters found themselves unable to match his skill in combat. Sparring sessions became one-sided duels, demonstrations of technique rather than contests of ability. The other students learned from him, but they could not surpass him. Mastery, however, brought something else: arrogance. Dooku did not merely see himself as talented, he saw himself as superior. He carried himself with the certainty of one who knew he was destined for greatness, and though he never openly defied his instructors, it was clear that he regarded himself as their equal. He respected Yoda, but even his master's teachings were questioned in silence. This conflict extended beyond combat. Dooku was not just a warrior, he was a thinker, a philosopher who sought not only to master the blade, but to understand the nature of power itself. He challenged the Jedi's doctrine, questioning their passive role in the Republic. He saw how the Jedi were revered as protectors, yet allowed themselves to be governed by the whims of corrupt politicians. Would a true guardian stand by while injustice flourished? Yoda cautioned him against such thinking, warning that the Jedi were not conquerors, that they served not through control, but through guidance. But to Dooku, such words seemed weak, an excuse for inaction. The Jedi had power. Why should they not use it to shape the galaxy as it should be? He did not yet have an answer. Not yet. But the thoughts remained, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when they would take root. He continued to train, continued to perfect his art, but deep within, he knew. The Order had shaped him into a warrior, but it had not decided what kind of warrior he would become. That choice would be his alone. For generations, the Jedi had served as the guardians of the Republic, sworn to uphold peace and justice across the galaxy. It was a belief ingrained in every Jedi from childhood. The Republic endures because the Jedi stand to defend it. But as Dooku ventured beyond the marble halls of Coruscant, that belief became harder to reconcile with reality. The Republic was not what the Jedi claimed it to be. It was bloated, decayed, stagnant. Corruption was woven into the fabric of its governance, a system so entangled in bureaucracy that entire worlds were left to fend for themselves while senators indulged in endless debates, their pockets lined with credits from corporate interests. Where the Jedi had once been revered as impartial mediators, they had become tools of the Senate. Diplomats to be sent where it was convenient, enforcers when the Republic's authority was challenged. Dooku saw this firsthand. His missions took him to systems where Republic influence had all but vanished, where governors acted as warlords and planetary leaders ruled through force rather than law. He stood before senators who spoke of unity and justice while allowing entire sectors to collapse in neglect. He mediated conflicts where the Jedi were summoned not to bring peace, but to reinforce the will of those who held power. The weight of these experiences lingered. He had spent years training in the Jedi Temple, perfecting his skill, studying the Force, believing that he was being shaped into something greater. But what was the purpose of power if it was spent serving a broken system? His concerns did not go unspoken. He brought them before the Jedi Council, questioning the Order's loyalty to a republic that no longer seemed to serve its people. He pointed to the planetary leaders who hoarded resources while their citizens starved, the senators who turned policy into a game of profit, the Republic's failure to act in any meaningful way. Their response was diplomatic, measured, careful, precisely what he had come to expect. They acknowledged the Republic's flaws, but they spoke of patience, of working within the system, of maintaining balance. The Jedi were not rulers, they reminded him. They did not dictate the course of galactic affairs, they preserved stability. But stability for whom? Dooku left those chambers with the first real fracture in his faith. The Council, with all its wisdom, had no intention of challenging the system they had sworn to protect. Their duty was not to justice, but to the illusion of peace. They would not act, not in the way the galaxy needed them to. That question stayed with him long after, the one that he could not yet answer. Did the Republic deserve the Jedi's protection? For years, Dooku had watched the Jedi Order with quiet disillusionment, seeing in them a reluctance to confront the galaxy's true decay. But he had remained, for duty, for tradition, for Qui-Gon. His former apprentice had been a rare mind among the Jedi, a man of wisdom, yet not bound by the rigid constraints of the Council. Qui-Gon saw beyond doctrine, beyond politics. He sought truth in the Force, even when that truth made him an outsider. And now, Qui-Gon Jinn was dead. Dooku received the news as a whisper carried through the corridors of the Jedi Temple, a story unfolding from afar. A battle on Naboo, a Sith Lord, a duel that ended in tragedy. Darth Maul's crimson blade had struck his apprentice down, and the Council had done nothing to prevent it. The Sith had returned, truly returned, for the first time in 1,000 years. Yet the Order had been blind to it. They had been warned. Qui-Gon had stood before the Jedi Council and spoken of the warrior he faced on Tatooine, a figure unlike any they had encountered in centuries. He had seen the threat. He had recognized what it meant, and they had dismissed him. It was their arrogance that had condemned Qui-Gon, their insistence that the Sith were nothing more than a phantom from history, that they could not have returned in secret, that the galaxy was safe under their watchful eye. And so, they had done nothing until it was too late. Dooku could hear their justifications before they were even spoken. The Sith had been eliminated. The threat had passed. They would remain vigilant, but there was no cause for panic, no cause for urgency. That was the moment his faith in the Jedi Order truly died. Dooku had spent decades as a Jedi Master, believing that the Order's failures could be corrected, that wisdom and patience would eventually bring change. But this was neglect. This was cowardice. The Sith had been operating in the shadows, their influence extending beyond what the Jedi had imagined possible. Yet instead of acting with the fury such a revelation demanded, the Council hesitated. They whispered of caution, of careful inquiry, of measured responses. But Dooku knew what he was seeing. Fear. The Jedi had become so concerned with preserving their position, so afraid of the consequences of true conflict, that they would rather pretend control than admit how little of it they actually had. Qui-Gon had been a Jedi Knight, but more than that, he had been Dooku's legacy, his finest student, his greatest work. He had been meant to lead, to reshape the Order into something greater than the stagnant institution it had become. And now, he was gone. Dooku did not mourn as others did. He did not weep. He did not speak of loss in hushed tones. He seethed. He sat in his chambers, fists clenched in the dim light of Coruscant's skyline, and he thought of the galaxy beyond these walls, the one the Jedi refused to see. The Republic was falling into decay. The Jedi had become its complacent servants, and now, with the Sith revealed, they would refuse to fight them as they should. Dooku stood before the Council in the days following Qui-Gon's death, watching as they deliberated, as they exchanged measured words, as they considered the implications rather than act. They debated whether Maul was truly a Sith, They analyzed the past. They pondered their next move. Dooku saw only stagnation, weakness. They would not hunt the Sith. Not as they should. They would send investigators, seek whispers of the dark side, but they would not act with the ferocity the moment required. He had known for years that the Republic was collapsing, but now he saw that the Jedi were collapsing with it. He saw Master Windu shift uncomfortably in his seat, saw Master Ki-Adi-Mundi voice his doubts, saw Yoda's eyes heavy with unspoken concerns, but none of them acted. Qui-Gon had deserved better than this. Dooku spoke only once. His voice was measured, but within it there was an edge that had not been there before. You failed him. There was no argument, no rebuttal. The words hung in the air, undeniable. And with that, he turned and left. Dooku had held the Jedi in high regard once. He had believed in their teachings, in their philosophy. He had accepted the burdens of duty and restraint, but no longer. He saw now what they refused to see, that the galaxy would not wait for them to wake up. The Sith had already returned. The Republic was already falling, and the Jedi were choosing to perish in irrelevance. The anger that burned within him was not impulsive, it was not wild, it was precise, calculated. He had spent years convincing himself that there was still a way forward within the Order, that the Jedi could change, but they would not. And if they would not change, then there was no future for them. There was no future for him. Dooku withdrew. He no longer attended council meetings. He no longer offered counsel to the younglings. His meditations were restless, filled with thoughts of the Jedi's growing irrelevance, of their refusal to evolve. And within him, something began to shift. The Jedi had abandoned their purpose. They had chosen silence. They had chosen caution. They had chosen a slow death. Dooku had no intention of dying with them. He would choose something else. The day he left the Jedi Order was not marked by fanfare. There was no grand farewell, no argument with the Council, no dramatic severing of ties. He simply walked away. And for the first time in years, he did not feel bound. The Jedi were prisoners of their own complacency. Dooku was not. He would find his own path. He would seek his own answers. The Republic would fall. And if no one else would take action, he would. The halls of the Jedi Temple had grown suffocating. Dooku had once walked them with purpose, with certainty, with the belief that he was part of something greater. Now, each corridor, each chamber, each whispered discussion among the council filled him with quiet contempt. He no longer saw wisdom, only fear masquerading as patience, complacency dressed as virtue. The death of Qui-Gon had broken something within him, but it had not left him empty. It had left him searching. Beyond the temple, the galaxy continued its slow decay. The Senate chambers echoed with empty rhetoric, with the ceaseless circular arguments of bureaucrats who had long since abandoned governance in favor of self-preservation. The Republic was no longer a body of leadership, but a corpse animated by greed, its heart long since stopped beating. And yet, this was the institution the Jedi still swore to protect. Dooku had withdrawn. He attended fewer council sessions, engaged in fewer discussions among the Order. The Jedi had become strangers to him, blind to the world they claimed to serve. They would not act. They would not change. And so, he had begun seeking voices elsewhere. One voice in particular spoke with the clarity he had been searching for. Chancellor Palpatine. Their meetings were always private, away from the endless noise of the Senate floor, in dimly lit chambers where power was not debated but decided. Dooku had expected arrogance, manipulation, the same shallow cunning that most politicians wielded as a blade. But what he found instead was a mind as sharp as his own, a man who saw the Republic's weaknesses with the same cold clarity he did. Their conversations were measured, elegant, never rushed. Palpatine did not preach. He did not demand. He simply spoke, offering thoughts that Dooku had already begun forming on his own. The Republic could not be reformed. It was too late for that. The corruption was not a flaw in the system, it was the system, and the Jedi, bound to it by tradition and duty, were nothing more than caretakers of a doomed order. The difference between them and men like Palpatine, Dooku realized, was that the Chancellor did not pretend otherwise. It was Palpatine who first introduced the idea that the Jedi did not need to be destroyed, only replaced. Not in a single day, not through bloodshed and war, but through something far greater, a restructuring of power itself. The Jedi had lost their way because they had forgotten what power truly was. They no longer shaped the galaxy. They reacted to it, desperate to maintain a balance that no longer existed. Dooku saw the inevitability of it as clearly as he saw the stars. The Republic was dying. The Jedi Order would fall with it. But something new could be built from its remains. Slowly, he began stepping away from the Order, not openly, not with defiance, but with deliberate silence. He ceased offering counsel in the council chambers, knowing his words would only fall on ears unwilling to listen. He no longer saw himself as one of them, and in truth, he suspected they had already begun to sense it as well. There were no goodbyes, no formal declaration of departure. The moment had been building for years. It was not a question of whether he would leave, but when. The Order was decaying, stagnant. He would not stagnate with it. He had seen the future, and it did not belong to the Jedi. It belonged to those willing to reshape it. The Jedi Order had been Dooku's life for decades, but it had never been his home. Coruscant had never felt like Serenno. The halls of the temple, with their stone serenity and whispered teachings, had shaped him, but they had not claimed him. When he left, he did not mourn. He did not hesitate. The Jedi were stagnant. The Republic was rotting. He had no intention of decaying with them. Serenno lay before him once more, vast and untouched by the bureaucratic filth that had consumed the core worlds. Unlike the Republic, Serenno had never begged for its place in the galaxy. It had commanded it. A world ruled by lineage, power, and aristocratic tradition. Yet, the blood that had once bound him to it had also cast him out. He had not been expected to return. His ship descended over the capital, cutting through skies that had not seen his presence in a lifetime. The House of Dooku had thrived without him. His absence had not left a wound. His name had not been spoken in mourning. He was not an heir returning to claim what was rightfully his. He was a man who had abandoned his birthright, now seeking to reclaim it. The nobility received him with caution, not reverence. They were not fools. They knew what he had been, a Jedi, a servant of the Republic, a man bound by a code that had long viewed power as something to be feared. And now he stood before them as something else, a man without an order, without allegiance. His claim to his birthright was unquestionable. His father was gone, his name still carried weight. But power was not inherited, it was earned. The nobles of Serenno would not bend simply because he had returned. They measured him, their eyes searching for the boy who had been cast aside and the man who had returned in his place. Only Genza met him without suspicion. His sister had remained while he had been trained to serve another master. She had learned the game of power in ways he had not. She had watched as the nobility maneuvered, as alliances were formed and broken. Serenno was not ruled by mere blood. It was ruled by those who understood how to wield it. "You are Dooku of Serenno," she said, her voice steady. "But the Jedi took something from you. They stripped you of what it means to be a ruler. They shaped you into something else, something apart from us." She was not wrong. Dooku was a Jedi no longer, but neither was he fully an aristocrat. He did not share the blind devotion to tradition that had defined their house for generations. The Force had always been his ally, his weapon. He had spent his life mastering it, refining it, not as the Jedi had wanted, but as he had willed it. "The Republic is collapsing," he told her. "The Jedi are blind to it. The Senate is rotted through with corruption, and the Jedi serve them still, unwilling to see what must be done." She did not flinch at his words. "And you see what must be done?" He did not hesitate. "I do." The nobility of Serenno valued strength. They had always remained independent from the Republic because they understood the dangers of submission. Dooku's vision was not of submission, it was of ascendance. Serenno had the resources, the wealth, the influence to stand against Coruscant, but standing alone would not be enough. The world would become something greater, a center of power, a force beyond mere nobility. He spoke to the ruling houses not of maintaining Serenno's isolation, but of using their strength to reshape the galaxy. The Republic was bloated, weak, incapable of governing the systems that still foolishly placed faith in it. The Jedi were too bound by their own morality to act. "But we are not bound," Dooku said. "We have the means to bring order to chaos. The means to create something stronger than the Republic's decaying corpse." Not all of them agreed. Some still saw a Jedi when they looked at him. Some still feared what he had once served. But they did not turn him away. They listened. And listening was enough. His return to Serenno was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning. His exile had forged him into something more than an aristocrat, more than a Jedi. He had left the Order because it had refused to see what was necessary. He had returned because he had found clarity. Serenno would not stand alone. It would become something greater. A movement had begun. The Republic was bloated, decaying beneath its own weight. Corruption had seeped into its foundations, spreading through the Senate like a disease. The Jedi, once the galaxy's guardians, had become its enforcers, shackled to the will of weak-willed politicians who no longer served the people, only their own ambitions. The Republic had once been a force for stability, but now it was something else. A relic, a rotting carcass held together by bureaucracy and blind tradition. Dooku had seen its failings firsthand. He had witnessed entire star systems abandoned by Coruscant, left to fend for themselves while senators grew fat on the wealth of their suffering. He had pleaded for change, spoken of reform, and had been met with nothing but silence. The Republic would not change. It could not. And so he would tear it down. But war could not be waged with ideals alone. Revolution required more than conviction. It needed resources, alliances, infrastructure. Serenno, for all its wealth, could not stand alone against the Republic's might. If Dooku was to break the Republic, he would need to build something greater. He would need an army. His first step was not to rally warriors, but to find those who had already lost faith. Dissatisfaction with Coruscant was widespread. The Outer Rim, long neglected, had grown weary of the Senate's indifference. Entire systems were ruled by figures who had no love for the Republic, governors, merchants, warlords, and aristocrats who had watched their planet suffer under its failing policies. Many had considered leaving the Republic before, but no leader had emerged with the strength to unify them. Dooku became that leader. He spoke not of rebellion, but of liberation. He did not promise anarchy, but order restored, a new system, one free from the corruption that had plagued Coruscant for too long. He traveled from world to world, meeting with rulers, negotiating with leaders, sowing the first seeds of what would become a movement. Some agreed immediately, others hesitated, uncertain of whether true change could be achieved. But Dooku was not merely a politician, nor was he merely a Jedi who had abandoned his oath. He was something more, a noble who understood power, a warrior who had mastered the Force, a strategist who could see the future more clearly than those who still clung to the past. Still, idealism alone could not wage war. He needed more than discontented worlds. He needed the economic forces that could sustain a movement. The Trade Federation had suffered humiliation on Naboo, its leaders bitter over the Republic's interference in its affairs. They sought protection from the Senate's regulations, and Dooku offered them more than protection. He offered them autonomy. The banking clan, ever pragmatic, did not concern itself with politics, only profit. They saw war not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. Dooku spoke to them not as a warrior, but as a businessman. The Republic was unstable. Conflict was inevitable. Would they back a failing institution, or would they invest in something new, something rising? The Techno-Union, the manufacturers of the galaxy's most advanced droids and weaponry, recognized the potential of a republic too weak to control them. War would bring contracts, demand, wealth. Dooku gave them exactly what they wanted, the freedom to operate without oversight, without limitations. One by one, they aligned with him, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. The Republic did not see it. It did not hear the whispered meetings, the signed agreements, the plans being drawn in the shadows. It did not see the trade routes shifting, the funds being moved, the factories repurposing their production. It did not see war coming, but war was already here. The Republic was crumbling. Dooku had seen it from within, watched as the Senate devolved into little more than a den of feckless politicians, each more concerned with their own power than the fate of the galaxy. The Jedi, bound by tradition and their misguided servitude to a failing government, refused to act. He had left them behind, turned his back on their blindness, and forged something greater, a movement that would bring true order where the Republic had failed. But revolution alone was not enough. There were forces in the galaxy older than the Republic, older even than the Jedi, the Sith. The very name conjured fear, a whispered specter that the Jedi believed long defeated. But Dooku had learned that history was far more complex than the Order's carefully curated teachings. The Sith had not been destroyed. They had simply adapted. They had waited. And now, they were poised to reshape the galaxy. And so, Darth Sidious revealed himself. There was no dramatic unveiling, no theatrical declaration of allegiance. The moment had been long in the making, the result of careful conversations, measured revelations, and a gradual unraveling of truths that Dooku had already begun to suspect. Palpatine had always been more than a mere politician. He had spoken of the Republic's decay with the clarity of one who saw beyond illusions. Now, he laid his cards on the table. He was the Sith Lord. The revelation might have horrified another man, but Dooku was not another man. He did not recoil in disgust, nor did he refuse to listen. He was intrigued. The Sith were painted as agents of chaos, as destroyers without purpose. But was that truly the case? The Jedi preached peace, yet they were blind to their own failures. They spoke of balance, but upheld a broken republic. If the Sith were enemies of stagnation, if they sought to remake the galaxy, then perhaps the Jedi had been wrong about them, just as they had been wrong about so much else. Sidious did not demand submission. That was not his way. He merely spoke, and Dooku listened. "The Sith do not seek destruction," Sidious told him. "We seek control. We do not thrive in chaos. We eliminate it. The Jedi wish to preserve a system that no longer functions. We will rebuild it." And Dooku understood. It had been in front of him all along. The Sith Code was not a doctrine of mindless aggression. It was the foundation of something stronger than the frail dogma of the Jedi. The Sith did not shackle themselves to tradition. They embraced the truth of power. Strength ruled the galaxy, whether one admitted it or not. And strength was not inherently cruel, nor was it inherently selfish. It was simply necessary. The ritual was not dramatic. It was deliberate, clinical, inevitable. Dooku had already left the Jedi behind, already renounced the weakness of their philosophy. The moment he saw the Republic for what it truly was, his path had been set. The Sith did not demand faith. They required only clarity. And Dooku had never seen with greater clarity than in that moment. And so he knelt. The words were spoken, an ancient rite that had passed from master to apprentice for 1,000 years. The Jedi had their traditions, and so did the Sith. But where the Jedi sought submission to an order beyond themselves, the Sith forged their own path. Sidious regarded him with something that might have been approval. "You have already cast aside the Jedi's chains. You understand what must be done. From this moment forward, you are Darth Tyrannus." The name was not chosen lightly. It was not a symbol of destruction, but dominion. Tyranny was a word the weak feared, but in its purest form, it was structure. It was control. And control was what the galaxy needed most. Darth Tyrannus rose. Dooku, the fallen Jedi, was no more. The architect of the separatist cause had become something greater. The chosen hand of the Sith, the herald of the new order to come. The Republic was stagnant, the Jedi blind, the Senate bloated with corruption. The galaxy teetered on the edge of collapse, and Darth Tyrannus was no longer a mere observer. He was the hand that would tip the scales. War was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and war required architects. The separatist movement had begun as a political rebellion, a response to the Republic's failure to govern the far reaches of the galaxy. But words alone would not be enough to break the Republic's hold. A revolution could not thrive on ideology alone. It needed strength. It needed soldiers. It needed a military force capable of crushing the Republic's illusion of security. Tyrannus had already begun laying the foundation before the Republic even recognized the threat. The grand deception of the Kaminoan cloning project was one of Sidious's most masterful manipulations, and Tyrannus played his role to perfection. Long before the first shots of the Clone Wars were fired, before the Jedi suspected treachery, a shadow war was already being waged. The orders had been given in secret, the arrangements made behind closed doors. Kamino was far from the prying eyes of the Senate, its cloning facilities isolated and concealed within the raging storms of its endless oceans. It was the perfect birthplace for the army that would tear the Republic apart. It was Tyrannus who made the necessary arrangements, who presented himself as the enigmatic benefactor, the one who ensured the Kaminoans had everything they required to create an army that no one knew they needed. Jango Fett had been the perfect choice. A Mandalorian warrior of unmatched skill, a bounty hunter whose reputation instilled fear across the galaxy. He was no mere hired gun. He was the template, the genetic foundation upon which an entire generation of soldiers would be built. Tyrannus had chosen him carefully, not simply for his combat prowess, but for his fierce independence, his ability to shape warriors who would follow orders with unwavering precision, yet retain the ability to think for themselves. A mindless army would crumble under the weight of real war. A disciplined one, trained to obey yet capable of adapting. That was the army the Sith required. The clones would be engineered with genetic enhancements, accelerated aging, and behavioral conditioning, all designed to mold them into the perfect soldiers. Yet the greatest weapon they carried would remain hidden, a single command buried deep within their minds, waiting to be activated. Order 66. The Jedi would believe they commanded these soldiers, that they led an army loyal to the Republic's cause. They would march into war without ever realizing they had already lost. But while the Republic prepared unknowingly for a war, it did not yet understand. Tyrannus ensured that the separatists would be ready. Serenno had become the beating heart of a growing military machine, but it would take more than noble houses and political maneuvering to build an army capable of standing against the Republic. The separatists had the advantage of foresight, of preparation. Tyrannus would not let that advantage slip away. He turned to the most powerful corporate entities in the galaxy, forging alliances with the Trade Federation, the Banking Clan, the Techno Union, the Commerce Guild. Their wealth and resources were vast, their grievances against the Republic deep-seated. Each had been wronged by a government that saw them as tools rather than partners. Each was willing to invest in the future Tyrannus promised them. The Trade Federation's droid legions were expanded, their manufacturing facilities repurposed to create warships, battle tanks, legions of mechanized soldiers programmed for conquest. The Banking Clan ensured that credits flowed freely, funding military campaigns that had not yet begun. The Techno Union provided the scientific advancements necessary to give the separatist war machine its edge. Droid commanders, cybernetic enhancements, advanced battle strategies that would overwhelm the Republic's outdated tactics. What had once been a political movement had now become a superpower. The Jedi had fought countless skirmishes, but never a war of this scale. They were trained to combat insurgencies, to defend against planetary conflicts. But what was coming was not a conflict of isolated systems. It was a war that would engulf the entire galaxy. And Tyrannus knew that when war arrived, the Jedi would not be ready. They had spent centuries as peacekeepers, negotiating treaties, mediating disputes. They had forgotten what it meant to wage war. They had lost their instinct for survival. The Jedi believed in the code, in the strength of the Republic, in the illusion of peace. But peace had never been more than a fragile construct, a fantasy sustained only by those too blind to see the cracks forming beneath them. Those cracks were widening. The Republic was unprepared. The Jedi were complacent. The separatists were rising. The first echoes of war had begun. Darth Tyrannus stood at the precipice of history, not as a mere participant, but as its architect. The Jedi once revered Count Dooku as one of their finest swordsmen, a warrior of elegance and control. Now they feared him. His name was no longer spoken in admiration, but with trepidation. He had abandoned the illusions of restraint, cast aside the Jedi's outdated philosophies. Where once he wielded a blade in the service of peace, now he wielded it for dominance. Form 2. Makashi was always his weapon of choice, an ancient art designed for precision, refinement, and single combat. Where the Jedi evolved toward blaster deflection and battlefield tactics, he perfected the art of the duel. The weight of his lightsaber was not an afterthought, not an extension of the Force's will. It was a blade to be wielded with precision, a tool of calculated destruction. While Jedi clung to defensive forms, to pacifistic gestures in the heat of battle, Dooku understood that mastery of the blade was mastery of control. A duel was never simply about victory. It was about exposing the weaknesses of an opponent, shattering their will before a single strike was landed. The Jedi had forgotten this, but he had not. Geonosis would be the stage where he reminded them. As the first battle of the Clone Wars erupted, the Republic's armies descended upon the separatist stronghold. The Jedi had arrived in force, leading their new legions, believing they would swiftly end the war before it could truly begin. But Dooku had planned for their arrival. They would not find an enemy caught unprepared. They would not leave unscathed. In the depths of the Geonosian catacombs, he faced Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. Two warriors, each formidable in their own right. One, a master of Soresu, the defensive bulwark of the Jedi. The other, an untamed storm of raw power and instinct. Together, they should have been an overwhelming force. But against Dooku's precision, they were outmatched. Kenobi struck first, relying on his mastery of defense, anticipating an opening that never came. Dooku dictated the rhythm of the battle, forcing his opponent to react, keeping him on the back foot. With fluid movements he evaded each strike, his ripostes precise and surgical. The Jedi Master faltered, unable to find a weakness. Then came Skywalker, reckless, powerful, predictable. Dooku toyed with him, baiting him forward with effortless counters, exploiting his frustration. Strength alone was not enough, not against skill honed over decades. With a final stroke, he cut down the young Jedi, severing his arm in a single elegant motion. Victory was never in question, but the battle was not over. A presence filled the chamber, ancient and undeniable. The air grew thick with power as Yoda entered the fray. Dooku did not hesitate. He had long known this moment would come. He had faced many Jedi, but Yoda was different. Their duel was not a contest of strength, nor of mere technique. It was a battle of philosophies, of conviction. Dooku, the fallen Jedi, the Count who had abandoned his birthright to forge a new order. Yoda, the last bastion of the Jedi's golden age, the Grand Master who had seen centuries of war and peace. The air crackled with the Force as their blades met, each strike a conversation, each movement a declaration. Dooku's Makashi was flawless, precise, efficient, unwavering. Yoda, though smaller in stature, was relentless, his mastery of Ataru turning his speed into a blur of motion. The chamber trembled with their clash. But even in the face of Yoda's overwhelming agility, Dooku did not falter. He was not a mindless Sith brute, not a marauder relying on sheer aggression. He was a tactician, a strategist, a warrior who fought not to prove superiority, but to achieve his objectives. He would not allow himself to be drawn into a fight he did not need to win. The separatist forces were already withdrawing. The war had begun. This was no longer about personal victory. This was about control. With a final calculated move, he disrupted the duel, not with his blade, but with a test of Yoda's compassion. A collapsing structure, a falling pillar, a distraction that forced the Jedi to abandon the fight in order to save his allies. It was not cowardice, it was efficiency. Dooku left Geonosis knowing he had accomplished everything he set out to do. He had bested 2 Jedi, humbled a 3rd, and escaped unscathed. He had proven that the separatists had the strength to stand against the Republic, and most importantly, he had sent a message to the Jedi Order. The Clone Wars had begun. The Republic called him a warlord, but Count Dooku presented himself as a statesman. His voice was measured, his demeanor regal. He did not rally his followers with unrestrained fury, but with the quiet conviction of a ruler who had seen the truth. The Republic was corrupt. The Jedi were blind. The separatist movement was not an act of rebellion. It was the salvation of countless worlds shackled to a decaying system. In public, he was the visionary Count of Serenno, the noble dissenter who had abandoned the Jedi not for selfish gain, but for the greater good. His words resonated across the mid and outer rim, where planetary leaders had grown weary of a republic that taxed them, yet offered no protection, that governed yet failed to listen. But in the shadows, Dooku was something else entirely. A war is not won on the battlefield alone. It is fought in whispers, in the silent exchange of secrets, in assassinations that never make the front page of a hollow news report. While the Republic drowned in its own bureaucracy, Dooku played a far more intricate game. He did not simply command fleets and droid armies, he cultivated networks. The separatist movement was more than an alliance of discontented systems. It was a war machine fueled by industry, espionage, and subterfuge. The Techno-Union built his warships. The banking clan funneled credits into his armies. The Trade Federation blockaded entire systems, starving planets into submission. And behind it all, Count Dooku orchestrated events with ruthless precision. His reach extended beyond politics and economics. He had spies in the Senate, informants within the Republic's military, agents embedded in Jedi affairs. He did not need to wield a lightsaber to bring down his enemies. He had others for that. Asajj Ventress, savage Opress Cad Bane. Assassins and bounty hunters moved at his command, striking at Republic targets before they could become threats. The Jedi Council did not understand the war they were fighting. While they debated strategy within the halls of Coruscant, Dooku's operatives were already eliminating key figures before battle lines could even be drawn. The war was not just fought with legions of droids, but with shadows and whispers. Yet Dooku's deception extended beyond the Republic. To the separatist leaders, he was their guiding light, the one who would lead them into a new era. They trusted him, believed in his vision. But he knew the truth. The confederacy of independent systems was never meant to last. He had seen the future, not through prophecy, but through the cold calculations of a strategist. This war had an ending, and it was not one the separatists would survive. They were pawns, pieces on a board moved by a far greater force. Darth Sidious had promised a new order. The Republic would fall, the Jedi would be purged, and when the dust settled, the galaxy would need a new ruler. Dooku did not fear this outcome. He welcomed it. For years, he had maneuvered within the shadows of the Republic, pretending to be the noble dissenter, the reasonable leader. But he had outgrown the role of a mere politician. He had shaped the war. He had ensured its survival. And when the Republic collapsed, he would be ready to take his rightful place. But even a master of deception could not foresee every move. Dooku had built the separatists into a powerful force, yet he had also bound himself to them. He had enemies on both sides, Republic generals who saw him as a Sith warlord, and separatist leaders who would turn on him the moment they realized the truth. For all his foresight, Dooku was still a piece in another's design. The Jedi had their flaws, but he had underestimated their resilience. The Republic was corrupt, but he had underestimated its ability to endure. And Sidious, the mentor who had given him a greater purpose, had plans beyond what Dooku had been told. The war was escalating, Jedi were dying, the Republic was stretched thin. Yet Count Dooku, the architect of conflict, was beginning to sense something he had never expected: doubt. The Jedi taught that power must be tempered with restraint. The Sith taught that power must be claimed, shaped, made into a weapon. Count Dooku had spent a lifetime refining his mastery of the Force, yet within the confines of the Jedi Code, his potential had been leashed, its raw depths unexplored. That limitation no longer existed. Dooku was no wild acolyte, no reckless seeker of forbidden knowledge. He approached Sith teachings as a scholar, a strategist, a sovereign. The dark side was a force of nature, volatile, untamed. It was the duty of the strong to wield it with precision, to refine its chaos into something controlled. Where Darth Maul had been an instrument of raw aggression, and Vader would one day become a creature of wrath, Dooku was something different, a Sith who wielded darkness with elegance. Force lightning had been his first true revelation. There was grace in its execution. A Jedi would scoff at such a notion, seeing only brutality in its crackling arcs of power. But Dooku understood the artistry. It was not mere destruction. It was a statement of mastery, an extension of control. The unworthy flung lightning wildly, consumed by their own rage. Dooku channeled it with purpose. His strikes were deliberate, his arcs of power precise. A controlled surge could break a man's will, bring even a Jedi to their knees without ending their life. A focused stream could reduce an opponent to nothing but scorched bone and silence. Yet, for all its power, lightning was merely the beginning. Sidious had shown him more. The Sith had delved into knowledge that even the Jedi archives dared not keep. Alchemy, sorcery, rituals older than the Republic itself. These were not parlor tricks or the crude conjurations of Night Brothers on Dathomir. This was the science of the ancient Sith, the reshaping of reality through the will of the dark side. On Serenno, Dooku had access to texts older than the Republic, relics sealed away for generations. He studied the methods by which Sith Lords had extended their lives, had twisted the very fabric of life itself. There were secrets buried beneath the sands of Korriban, hidden among the ruins of Malachor, whispered in the forgotten tongues of the ancients. Dooku was not driven by obsession, nor did he seek immortality like some foolish warlock clinging to life. He sought understanding. What was the true nature of the Force? The Jedi saw it as a guide, the Sith as a tool. Dooku saw it as a truth waiting to be revealed, an unclaimed power that only those with the will to see beyond doctrine could ever grasp. But knowledge was a double-edged blade. For all his control, for all his refinement, Dooku began to wonder, was he still the master of his own fate? The Sith preached strength, yet he had never felt more bound than he did now. He had thought himself Sidious's ally, but he had begun to understand the true nature of their relationship. Sidious was not a teacher, he was a predator. The Dark Lord offered knowledge, but never freely. Every lesson was another link in a chain, another test of obedience. Power was given, but always at a cost. Dooku had played this game before. As a Jedi, he had been a servant to a failing Republic. Now, he was a servant to a master whose vision remained shrouded. How much longer would he be a student? How much longer would he be a pawn? He had surpassed Jedi and Sith alike in dueling. He had built an empire of war. He had commanded the greatest armies the galaxy had ever seen. What more did he need to prove? Dooku knew power. He had studied the dark side, mastered it with the same meticulous discipline that had defined his life. But beneath his composed exterior, beneath the cold certainty in his voice, there was an unspoken truth. Sidious had never planned to rule beside him. Sidious had only ever needed a means to an end. And Count Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, had begun to see the shape of the end hurtling toward him. The Sith preach that power is the only truth, that loyalty is an illusion. Yet even the most disciplined mind, the most hardened master of the dark side, cannot always escape the weight of their own choices. Count Dooku had never believed in attachment, not as a Jedi, not as a Sith. But when the order came to sever the bond with his greatest apprentice, a shadow of doubt took root. Darth Sidious had spoken the command without hesitation. Ventress had grown too strong. There was no explanation beyond that. No reasoning, no justification. It was simply fact, and Dooku was expected to comply. For years, Asajj Ventress had been his weapon. She had been a blade honed in the crucible of war, a student who had embodied his ideals more fully than any Jedi had ever dared. She was ruthless, disciplined, and above all, loyal to him. Not to the Sith, not to Sidious, to him. And that, perhaps, was the real danger. Ventress had never been formally anointed as a Sith, never truly granted the title of apprentice. She was a tool, a secret, a warrior unleashed when the separatist cause demanded swift and decisive retribution. She had learned his teachings, studied his technique, and refined her skills under his watchful eye. In every way that mattered, she was his legacy. But the Sith had no use for legacies. Sidious had always been clear. There were only two. The rule of two was absolute. If Ventress had grown powerful enough to warrant concern, that could mean only one thing. Dooku was grooming her as more than a mere assassin. Had he? The thought unsettled him. Ventress had always been a means to an end, a warrior who served his will. He had granted her knowledge, but had he granted her too much? Had she, without his intent, become a threat not only to Sidious but to himself? Dooku did not believe in sentiment, yet something gave him pause. Sidious did not fear Ventress. He feared the possibility that Dooku might one day seek to replace him. And so the order was given. Kill her. For the first time since swearing himself to the Sith, Dooku hesitated. To kill Ventress was to erase years of investment, to sever a weapon that had won him countless battles. It was a waste. It was inefficient. But that was not the reason for his hesitation. The Sith demanded absolute obedience. He had spent his life shaping his own path, seeking power not as a reckless brute, but as a ruler, a tactician. And yet here he was, taking orders. Did he command, or was he still merely a servant? Ventress had been a loyal blade, but loyalty was a fragile thing. He knew she would not die easily, and if she survived, her allegiance would shatter. She would not forgive this betrayal. The choice was already made. Dooku summoned his forces. The strike was executed without hesitation. He did not offer Ventress a warning, nor did he grant her an opportunity for explanation. She had been his weapon. Now she was discarded. She did not die that day. She escaped, as he knew she would. Sidious' will had been carried out, but the moment the attack was ordered, something fundamental had changed. Ventress was not the only one betrayed that day. Dooku had believed himself a master of his own fate, yet this moment exposed a truth he had long ignored. He had never been the true master. He had always told himself that he followed Sidious out of strategy, that their partnership was an alliance of necessity. But an alliance implied equal standing, and this was not that. This was subjugation. He had done what was expected, not what he would have chosen. And in that realization, something within him cracked. Ventress had been a test. Sidious had forced his hand, knowing full well what it would reveal. Dooku was not yet his own master. Not yet. But he would be. One day, Sidious would make a demand, and Dooku would refuse. One day, the apprentice would rise. One day, Tyrannus would take his throne. Count Dooku had always believed himself to be above the reckless ambition that had consumed so many before him. He was not a brute, nor a fool driven by blind hatred or unchecked hunger for power. He was a visionary, a ruler, a strategist. Every move he had made, every war he had waged, had been a calculated step toward a future only he could see. A galaxy unshackled from the corruption of the Republic. A new order governed by strength, by reason, by those worthy of command. But something had changed. The weight of the war pressed down upon him. The confederacy of independent systems had grown vast, its armies stretching across the stars, its leaders bound together by necessity rather than true loyalty. The idealists, the opportunists, the warlords, they had all come to him, not for his vision, but for their own gains. They saw him as the figurehead, the noble warrior standing against the Republic's tyranny. But few understood what was truly at stake. Even his greatest creation, General Grievous, was proving to be a disappointment. Dooku had personally trained the cyborg warrior, shaping him into a fearsome duelist, a weapon meant to challenge the Jedi on the battlefield. But raw power was not enough. Grievous lacked the refinement of a true master. He was relentless, aggressive, but undisciplined. There was no elegance in him, no understanding of the deeper truths of the Force. He wielded stolen lightsabers, but they were trophies, not extensions of his will. He was not a successor. He was a tool, a blunt instrument, and even instruments could break. The war had become a machine that no longer answered to a single hand. The Separatist Council, once willing to follow Dooku's guidance without question, had grown restless. The warlords he had empowered now sought to carve out empires of their own. The Techno-Union and the banking clan whispered behind closed doors. The Trade Federation grew bolder in its demands. Even his most trusted commanders were beginning to doubt the war's purpose. The signs were clear. Treachery was inevitable. For all his strength, for all his foresight, Dooku was no longer in control. Perhaps he had never been. He had told himself that he was the architect of this war, that he had shaped the Separatists into a force capable of toppling the Republic. But the Republic had not fallen. It had adapted. Chancellor Palpatine, Sidious, had ensured it. Dooku had never doubted his master's genius. He had long accepted that Sidious played the long game, that every victory and every setback served a greater purpose. But for the first time, Dooku wondered if he had ever truly understood that purpose. He had believed that he was to be the vanguard of the new order, that he would stand at Sidious' side when the time came to reshape the galaxy. Yet now, he sensed something far more insidious. Sidious did not need him. The Republic's strength had not waned as expected. The war had only strengthened it. The Senate, once bloated and weak, now followed Palpatine's every command. The Jedi, whom Dooku had expected to fracture under the weight of endless battle, had instead become warriors. They had abandoned their old ways, embracing war with a fervor that should have repulsed them. And all of it had been allowed to happen, not by Dooku, by Sidious. The realization was a bitter one. Had he been nothing more than a pawn, a tool to be discarded, just as he had discarded Ventress? He dismissed the thought. Number. He was more than that. He had built an army. He had challenged the Republic in ways no one else had dared. He had forced the Jedi to compromise themselves, to sacrifice their ideals in the name of survival. He had done everything that needed to be done. But then why did the war feel as though it was slipping from his grasp? Why did it feel as though his purpose had already been fulfilled? He had always prided himself on his ability to see the battlefield beyond the immediate skirmish, to understand the war beyond the next victory. But now, as he stood at the precipice of what should have been his greatest triumph, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He was no longer the master of this conflict. He was a piece within it, and pieces could be moved or sacrificed. The Clone Wars had raged for 3 years, a war designed to be endless, to grind the Republic and the Jedi into dust, to leave them vulnerable for the final strike. Count Dooku had played his role flawlessly. His separatist forces had held the Republic in a relentless vice, bleeding its strength, consuming its resources, turning the noble Jedi Order into weary generals, leading armies of disposable soldiers. And now, at long last, the end game was near. The Republic teetered, its forces stretched thin, its citizens weary of war, its Senate ruled by a leader who had long since abandoned the facade of a mere chancellor. Palpatine was absolute. The Supreme Chancellor now wielded power beyond anything the Republic had ever seen, and Dooku believed this was the moment they had been waiting for. He had followed Sidious for years, waiting for the signal, the moment where the Republic's fall would be set in motion. He had prepared for it, knowing that when the time came, the Jedi would be purged, the Senate dissolved, and the Republic reforged into a system of true strength, guided by those who understood the necessity of power. Dooku had always believed he would stand at the Chancellor's side when that moment came. A dark Lord of the Sith, a ruler of the new empire. He had been patient, watching as the Jedi exhausted themselves, as the Republic's corruption deepened, as the separatists became an unyielding force that could no longer be ignored. The time had come to deliver the final blow, to strike the heart of the Republic and expose its frailty. That was why he was here, aboard the Invisible Hand, standing at the precipice of history. He had no idea that the war had already ended. Dooku had orchestrated countless conflicts, dictated the course of war with the precision of a master tactician. But this battle, this moment, was not about military strategy. It was a performance. Palpatine had allowed himself to be captured, or so it seemed. He sat restrained in his chair, a prisoner of war, waiting to be rescued by the Republic's most celebrated champions, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. Dooku had fought them before. Kenobi was predictable, a gifted warrior, but bound by the Jedi code, unwilling to abandon the teachings that made him vulnerable. Skywalker, however, was something else entirely, a tempest barely contained, a fighter whose power came not from discipline, but from raw, untamed fury. Dooku had always respected his strength, but now he had orders to test him, to push him further, to let Skywalker embrace the rage that lay beneath his noble exterior. Palpatine had foreseen it. The young Jedi was to be turned, shaped into something greater, something the Sith had long sought. The duel was never meant to be fair. Dooku was instructed to weaken them, but not destroy them, to wound Kenobi, to exhaust Skywalker, to draw out the fire that burned inside him. Palpatine had been clear. Skywalker must be tested. But as Dooku engaged them, something was different. Skywalker was faster, stronger. He had fought Anakin before and had seen his aggression, but there had always been restraint. Now, there was none. Dooku countered with the same Makashi precision he had mastered decades before. He twisted, parried, struck with measured grace. He had fought Jedi Masters and Sith Lords alike. None had ever matched his technique. But Skywalker was relentless. Every strike was stronger than the last. The careful, composed duelist found himself pushed back, outmaneuvered, outmatched. Kenobi was gone, cast aside with ease, unconscious on the floor. But Skywalker kept coming. The elegance of the duel shattered. It was no longer an exchange of skill. It was something else entirely. Dooku saw the fury in Skywalker's eyes, felt the power radiating from him, and for the first time in years, he felt fear. The moment came with blinding speed. Dooku's lightsabers were wrenched from his grasp, his arms severed in a single merciless stroke. He fell to his knees, defenseless, defeated, his gaze lifted to the Supreme Chancellor, the man he had followed, the master he had served, the one who had promised him victory. "Kill him," Palpatine said. Dooku's breath caught in his throat. This was not the plan. He turned his gaze to Palpatine, searching for any sign of deception. There was none. The realization hit him like a blade through the heart. This had never been about the separatists. It had never been about him. Sidious had never intended to rule with Dooku at his side. Dooku had simply been a placeholder, a tool to create the chaos necessary for the true successor to emerge. Anakin Skywalker. Skywalker hesitated, his own morality still holding him back. Dooku saw it, the last remnant of the Jedi in him, the final strand of restraint that had not yet been severed. For a brief moment, Dooku thought he might be spared, but then Palpatine spoke again. "Do it." And Skywalker obeyed. The lightsabers crossed, and in one swift motion, Dooku's head fell. For all his power, for all his knowledge, Dooku had never truly seen the end. He had believed in the Sith's vision, but he had failed to understand the fundamental truth of their nature. The rule of two was not a promise. It was a cycle. A master would always seek an apprentice who would surpass them, and an apprentice would always crave power beyond their master's grasp. Dooku had been powerful. He had been a warrior, a ruler, a Sith Lord. But in the end, he had been a stepping stone. Sidious did not grieve him. Skywalker did not mourn him. The war he had started would continue without him, its true purpose finally revealed. The Jedi would fall, the Republic would collapse, and his name would be little more than a footnote in the history of a conflict he had thought he could control. Count Dooku of Serenno was dead, and the galaxy would move on without him. Count Dooku had fought hundreds of battles, faced Jedi Masters, Sith Lords, and warriors of every creed. He had refined Makashi into an art, an elegant weapon wielded by an elegant man. He had never been a brute, never relied on raw aggression. He did not flail like a barbarian or batter his opponents into submission. He dismantled them, and yet for all his mastery, for all his skill, he was about to die. The battle on the invisible hand was meant to be a display of power, not a true fight to the death. Palpatine had spoken of testing Anakin Skywalker, of showing him his true strength, of breaking him free of the Jedi's teachings. Dooku had accepted that, had even believed it necessary. He would challenge the young warrior, wound him, push him to the brink, and then surrender. He had played his part perfectly. He had taunted Skywalker, wielded his superiority like a scalpel, controlled the flow of battle with all the grace and precision that had made him legendary. Until Skywalker changed. Until the boy who had once been reckless, who had once been held back by doubt, became something else. Dooku had seen it too late. The Jedi had stormed the invisible hand, fighting their way through the corridors as separatist droids fell around them. Anakin and Obi-Wan, always together, bound by duty, by fate, had cut through his forces with terrifying efficiency. But the real fight was here, in this throne room. Dooku had descended the stairs in slow, deliberate steps, his hands clasped behind his back. He had faced these two before. He had defeated them before. "You won't escape this time, Dooku," Skywalker had said, voice cold, determined. Dooku had smirked. "Brave of you, boy, but foolish." He had drawn his saber, igniting the crimson blade with a flick of his wrist. The duel had begun. As always, Kenobi had been precise, measured, predictable. A master of Form 3, but too defensive, too cautious. He had adjusted to counter Dooku's style, but defense alone would never win against a master duelist. Skywalker, however, had been something else. Faster, stronger, more relentless than before. Dooku had struck at Kenobi first, exploiting his defenses, knowing how to break him down. It had worked before. It would work again. A well-placed feint, a flick of his saber, and Kenobi was out of the fight, cast aside, unconscious, a non-threat. That left Skywalker. Dooku had fought him before, and Anakin had always been aggressive. It was his weakness. The Jedi had tried to temper it, to force restraint into a soul that was never meant to be restrained. But this time, there was no restraint. Dooku felt it immediately. There was no doubt in Skywalker's movements, no hesitation in his strikes. He was power incarnate, a force of nature, a storm that could not be controlled. The elegance of their duel vanished. Dooku had been the teacher, the superior, but now he was the prey. Anakin's blade crashed against his own, sending shockwaves through his arms. Every strike was heavier than the last. Dooku parried, countered, maneuvered, but it was useless. For the first time in decades, Count Dooku was overpowered. Skywalker's blue saber came down like a hammer, relentless, brutal. Dooku staggered back, struggling to hold his ground. This was no longer a duel. This was annihilation. And then, it was over. With a vicious twist of his saber, Skywalker severed Dooku's hands. Pain lanced through his body as he collapsed to his knees, the agony of loss, of power ripped away from him, searing through his very soul. His lightsaber tumbled from his useless fingers, rolling across the floor. He looked up, panting, realizing how truly powerless he was. And then he saw the Chancellor. Dooku turned to his master. He expected to see calculation, approval, perhaps even amusement. He had been promised a new world, a new order, a galaxy forged in strength. Instead, he saw death. "Kill him," Palpatine said. For a moment, Dooku thought he had misheard. This was not the plan. He had been told Skywalker was to be turned, molded into the new apprentice, but Dooku had believed he would still have a place. He had been Sidious's right hand, the architect of the war, the one who had delivered the galaxy to him on a silver platter. He turned his gaze to Skywalker, desperation flickering beneath his usual composure. "Chancellor." Palpatine's face remained unreadable. "Do it." And in that moment, Dooku knew. He had never been meant to survive this war. He had never been Palpatine's true heir. Sidious had used him exactly as he had used the Jedi, the Republic, the separatists, the war itself. Dooku had always thought himself above deception, above manipulation, yet he had been nothing more than a pawn. He tried to speak, to plead perhaps, or to condemn, but there was no point. Skywalker hesitated for only a moment. Then the blades crossed. Dooku's world went dark. The invisible hand would crash. The war would continue. The Republic would fall. But Count Dooku would not be there to see it. His name would fade into history, his cause swallowed by the greater machinations of the Sith. He had thought himself a kingmaker, a master strategist, a Sith Lord who could shape the galaxy in his image. But in the end, he had been nothing more than a stepping stone. His death was neither triumphant nor tragic. It was simply necessary, and the galaxy moved on without him. The galaxy had always belonged to the strong. That was the truth Count Dooku had clung to, the doctrine that had guided him through war, betrayal, and power. Strength defined the worthy. The weak were to be ruled, to be discarded, to be forgotten. But as he knelt, hands severed, breath ragged, he understood that he was the one being discarded. For years, he had believed he was indispensable. Darth Tyrannus, heir to the Sith's grand design, architect of the separatist movement, Palpatine's most trusted ally. He had played his part flawlessly, too flawlessly. The war had unfolded precisely as Sidious had intended. The Republic weakened, the Jedi distracted, the galaxy poised to collapse. And now, the final step. The moment when Dooku himself was no longer necessary. Palpatine had spoken, his voice cold and resolute. "Kill him." Dooku's gaze snapped to the Sith Lord, the man he had served, the man he had trusted. The words echoed in his mind. Impossible, unthinkable. This was not how it was meant to be. Anakin Skywalker was meant to be tested, to be broken, to be brought to their side, but Dooku had never considered himself expendable. There should have been a moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt in his master's gaze. There was none. Palpatine had lied, not only about this, but about everything. For years, Dooku had believed himself a Sith Lord. He had believed in power, in control, in shaping the galaxy into something greater than the rotting husk the Republic had become. He had believed he mattered, but the truth was now undeniable. He had never been the future of the Sith. Dooku's mind raced through every conversation, every manipulation. He saw it all now, the shape of a plan that had never included him. From the beginning, he had been a tool, an instrument of Palpatine's will. The Jedi had been blind to the Chancellor's machinations, but so had he. He had been necessary for a time, to build an army, to lead a war, to prepare the stage for the rise of the Sith. But he was not the true apprentice. He was a placeholder, and now he was in the way. Anakin Skywalker had been the key all along. Dooku could see it now, the anger, the power, the raw potential. He had underestimated it, believed the boy to be strong but flawed. But Palpatine had seen his true strength. It was Skywalker, not Dooku, who would stand at Sidious's side. It was Skywalker who would inherit the Sith's power. Dooku had spent years bending the galaxy to his will, carving a path of war and destruction in the belief that he was shaping something new, something greater. But he had never been the architect of that vision. He had been a tool, a piece in a game far grander than he had imagined. And now, like all tools, he was to be discarded. Fear was foreign to Dooku. He had never given himself to it, not as a Jedi, not as a Sith. It was a lesser emotion, a burden carried by those who lacked control. And yet, he felt it now, not because he feared death, but because he understood in his final moments that he had never truly lived as he believed. He had thought himself a master of his own destiny. He had been wrong. Anakin stood over him, blade poised. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where the young warrior hesitated. Dooku saw it, the flicker of doubt, the weight of the Jedi code still lingering in his soul. For the first time in years, Dooku's lips parted, not to mock, not to command, but to beg. Not for his life, for understanding. Chancellor. The words barely left his mouth before Palpatine's voice cut through the silence. Do it. The hesitation vanished. Anakin's expression hardened. The blade fell. There was no triumph in death, no revelation, no moment of absolution, only emptiness. Dooku had lived by the Sith's code, strength above all. But in the end, he had been weak in the only way that mattered. He had trusted. His final thought was not one of defiance, nor anger, nor regret. It was understanding. Palpatine had not broken the Sith's cycle. He had simply perfected it. Dooku had been a means to an end. And now, that end had come. The blade passed through his neck. Darth Tyrannus, Count Dooku, Jedi Master, Sith Lord, ruler of Serenno, architect of war, was no more. The galaxy did not mourn him. His name would become a curse, a whisper in the history of a war that he had helped forge. But his death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of the Sith's true rise. The galaxy does not remember Count Dooku. Not truly. His name is a footnote in the Republic's downfall, a spectre lingering in the echoes of a war that consumed everything. He was the instigator, the warlord, the traitor, the man who abandoned the Jedi, who carved a path of blood across the stars, who led a doomed insurrection against an empire that had already been built beneath his feet. And yet, was he not right? The Republic he had condemned fell, not to his hand, but to its own corruption. The Jedi Order was destroyed, not by him, but by its own blindness. The system he despised crumbled into dust, and in its place rose the Empire, a machine of oppression far worse than anything Dooku had envisioned. He had spoken of the Republic's decay, the Jedi's stagnation, the failures that would doom them all. He had believed in a greater order, a galactic structure built on power and control, free from the weaknesses that had led to the Clone Wars. But he had been blind to the truth. He was never meant to fix the galaxy. He was meant to break it. There are no statues of Count Dooku, no planets sing his name, no people mourn his loss. He left no great Sith dynasty, no lasting rule. His empire, the Separatist alliance, was not his own. It was a fabrication, a construct engineered by Sidious to serve a single purpose: war. And war, as Dooku learned too late, was never about victory. It was about the purge. The Clone Wars were not waged to build a new future. They were waged to ensure that no one else could. Dooku had believed he was shaping something grander, something beyond himself. He had imagined a galaxy reborn, stripped of the Jedi's false virtue and the Republic's empty bureaucracy. He had envisioned a system where order reigned, where the strong ruled, where power dictated the fate of civilizations. And yet, the Sith did not rise from the ashes of the Republic. The Empire did. The Empire was not a Sith regime. It was a machine. It had no use for ancient Sith philosophy, no room for the refined intellect of an aristocrat turned Sith Lord. Dooku had sought to replace the Jedi, but Palpatine replaced them both. The Jedi who remembered him are gone. The few separatists who once believed in his cause are dead, their voices silenced, their rebellion erased from the galactic record. Those who might have whispered his name in darkened halls have been absorbed into the Empire, their ambitions repurposed, their ideals twisted into something unrecognizable. Even the Sith, the very order he had pledged himself to, forgot him. Darth Tyrannus was a transition, not a successor. A vessel for war, nothing more. His time had ended the moment Palpatine had no further use for him. He had trained no true apprentice, left no Sith holocrons, no teachings to be discovered in the ruins of the Empire. Dooku was a Sith Lord without a lineage, a fallen Jedi without a cause. And so his name faded. In the end, the Jedi Order was doomed whether Dooku had left it or not. His warnings had been correct, but his conclusions were flawed. Yes, the Republic was dying, but it was not meant to be reforged in war. Yes, the Jedi were stagnant, but they were not meant to be replaced with something worse. Had he remained in the Order, had he fought from within, could he have changed it? Could he have saved Qui-Gon? Could he have prevented the war? Could he have guided the Jedi away from their arrogance, away from their blind servitude to the Republic? Or was his fate always sealed? Did the dark side claim him the moment he first doubted the Order? He had convinced himself that the Republic's destruction would bring something greater, that he could control the tide of war, that he could bend the galaxy to his will. But he had been nothing more than a pawn. Sidious had played him as easily as he had played the Jedi. Dooku had believed that the Sith were the future, but they were not. The Sith Order had always existed in a cycle, master and apprentice. Two shadows moving through history, manipulating events, seizing power where they could. But Palpatine had done something no Sith before him had ever achieved. He ended the cycle. The Sith were meant to thrive in the shadows, to orchestrate power from behind the curtain. But Palpatine had no need for shadows. He was the galaxy now. The Sith had won, but in doing so, they had lost everything that made them Sith. Dooku had trained no successor. Palpatine had engineered one. And Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, was not a Sith Lord in the traditional sense. He was something else. Palpatine's creation. His enforcer, his hammer, his extension of will. And so, the Sith Order did not rise as Dooku had imagined. It perished in the throne room of the Death Star, the same way Dooku had perished aboard the Invisible Hand. Betrayed, forgotten, replaced. Count Dooku's legacy is a cautionary tale. He sought power but never truly had it. He sought to destroy the Republic but only paved the way for something worse. He sought to become a Sith Master but never stopped being a servant. Even his homeworld of Serenno, once the seat of his noble house, fell into obscurity. The planet did not rise under the Empire. It was not honored as the birthplace of a Sith Lord. It did not flourish under Imperial rule. It became irrelevant, like him. Dooku had once believed that his name would stand the test of time, that he would be remembered as the man who shaped the fate of the galaxy. But history does not honor those who are merely stepping stones. And that, in the end, was all he ever was. The war was over. The separatists had been crushed. The Republic had fallen. And from the ruins of both, an empire had risen. An empire built upon the ashes of every man and movement that had dared to stand against it. Dooku's grand vision, the dream of a galaxy freed from the corruption of the Senate, had been obliterated. The war that he had once commanded had ended not in the triumph of independence, but in the death of all that he had fought to create. And in the end, his name was not remembered. There were no statues raised in his honor, no mention of his deeds in the archives of the new imperial era. He was not a martyr. He was not a savior. He was a shadow. His death had not altered the fate of the galaxy. It had merely cleared the way for the one who would, Darth Vader. Had he been watching from beyond the grave, Dooku might have found it darkly ironic. All his life, he had sought to shape history, to leave behind a mark that would outlive him. He had seen himself as an architect of change, as the one who would guide the galaxy toward a new order. But now, he was a footnote. The Jedi Order was no more, wiped from existence in a single merciless stroke. He had once thought their destruction inevitable, that they had become too blind, too complacent, too unwilling to see the shifting currents of the galaxy. He had believed they would fall under the weight of their own inaction. And yet, even in their failure, they had been acknowledged. The Emperor had declared them traitors, had rewritten history to make them the architects of their own downfall. The Jedi had become legends, whether in infamy or remembrance. But no one spoke of Count Dooku. He had been a necessary sacrifice and nothing more. For all his wisdom, for all his mastery of politics and war, Dooku had failed to see the truth that had always been there. Sidious had never intended for him to rule. He had never been a true Sith, not in the way his master required. Dooku had thought himself an equal, a partner in the great work of reshaping the galaxy, but he had been a means to an end. A pawn dressed in the trappings of power, a temporary hand in a game that had already been won. The Sith had spoken of strength, of power, as the true currency of the universe. Dooku had believed in that philosophy, had wielded it as a weapon against the Republic and the Jedi. But in the end, It had been his own weakness that had doomed him. Weakness not in skill, nor in strategy, but in belief. He had not been cruel enough. He had not been ruthless enough. The Sith demanded complete devotion, the erasure of all sentiment, all morality, all personal ambition, save for the will of the dark side. Dooku had never been willing to surrender himself completely. Even as he had turned against the Jedi, he had clung to the idea that he was different, that he could wield the power of the Sith without being consumed by it, that he could remake the galaxy in his own image without becoming a slave to his master's vision. And for that, he had been cast aside. As the years passed, the galaxy moved on. The Sith ruled from Coruscant, and Vader took his place at the Emperor's side, a shadow where Dooku had once stood. The separatist cause, which had once been a movement powerful enough to shake the Republic to its core, was buried beneath layers of history and propaganda. It had never been a revolution. It had been a prelude. No one spoke of the noble Count of Serenno, the warrior philosopher who had defied the Jedi and the Senate alike. His name did not stir rebellion, did not inspire dissent. He had left no true successors, no movement to carry his legacy forward. The Jedi had been remembered, Sidious had prevailed, and Dooku had been erased. Had he chosen differently, what might have been? If he had remained with the Jedi, could he have been their salvation instead of their executioner? Could he have been the leader the Order so desperately needed, the one who would have led them into a new age rather than condemning them to destruction? If he had refused Sidious, if he had turned against the Sith before they had used him to their ends, could he have been the force that broke the cycle? These were questions without answers. But perhaps the truth was simpler than that. Perhaps Count Dooku of Serenno had never been destined to rule. His death had been swift, a moment of realization followed by the cold certainty of a blade at his throat. His final thought had not been of victory, nor of anger, nor even of regret. It had been of understanding. For all his power, for all his ambition, he had been nothing more than a tool in someone else's war. His fate had been written the moment he had placed his trust in Darth Sidious. He had sought freedom, but he had only exchanged one set of chains for another. Now, there was no one left to remember him. No one to mourn. No one to honor. The Sith had taken the galaxy, the Jedi had faded into myth, and the war had ended. But the name Dooku had already been forgotten.